London is not a beautiful city. Under the soot that covers its buildings is a teeming mass of 4 million souls trying to survive, mostly off of each other. You see it in the paper every day. Thankfully, we have the London Times to keep us informed of all these troubling activities with an unbiased eye and razor-sharp accuracy. We find this publication to be of invaluable assistance in our investigations, and I'm sure you will as well. Among the forces of evil which run rampant in this city, there are also, thankfully, 2 groups of individuals who will aid us in our cause. As we do, they attempt to right wrongs and restore harmony and civility to the streets of London. The first of these groups is a ragtag association of young ruffians. I call them the Baker Street Irregulars. Don't let them fool you. They may be scruffy and ill-bred, but they are on the right side of the law. They can go everywhere, see everything, and overhear everyone. They are my eyes and ears in the streets of London, unquestionably a tremendous asset in our work. They will help us in our investigations if they can. The other group is a far more civilized collection of gentlemen and institutions. I call them the Baker Street Regulars. They, too, will be extremely useful in our work. At the start of any investigation, do keep in mind that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Unwittingly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. The people and places to whom I will now introduce you will help us to collect the facts. May we use them wisely. Come, the game's afoot.
When you believe you have directed Holmes to all of the right and proper places, and you have enough information to name the murderer and the motive, choose this icon. Choosing this icon puts a notebook at your fingertips. I believe you'll find that your notebook is your greatest detective tool. Because the Baker Street Regulars are often critical to solving a case, I've included them in your notebook. Use them wisely. Choose this horse and carriage after you have chosen your destination from either your notebook or the directory. It will take you where you want to go. The Baker Street Irregulars are an untidy bunch of young street boys who happen to be on the proper side of the law. They have an undeniable knack for bringing back priceless bits of information in a fraction of the time it would take Holmes or myself. When you want to summons them, first choose the destination from your notebook or the directory, then choose the Irregulars. In no time at all, they will return with whatever details they were able to unearth. Mr. Holmes' files provide a wealth of information that he has been collecting over the years. Some of it is quite pertinent to the various cases, and some of it offers simply a fascinating and informative sidelight. When you want to access the files, first choose the destination from your notebook or the directory, then choose here when you want to see what relevant information Holmes might already have at hand. This gives you access to the London directory. In it, you will find everyone you need to query in your attempt to solve these cases. You may also use the directory much like your notebook. First, choose your intended destination, then choose the horse and carriage, and you'll have another way to get from one place to the next.
Body found in the Thames. Read it in the Times.
Holmes has always claimed that the newspaper is a treasure of information when one can read between the lines. When you are ready to consult the Times, you may, of course, simply choose here for a close-up view.
Mr. Henry Ellis is the foreign news editor for the London Times. He is a great reservoir of information of what's happening on the continent. He also has an interest in crime news. Ellis is always happy to help when he can, but you must be careful of what you tell him, or you might find what you've confided to him in the next day's Times. This is a records office housing documents pertaining to births, marriages, deaths, and last wills and testaments. Sir Jasper is the chief medical examiner for St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He is London's greatest forensic pathologist. You can depend on him for all the technical details that can be obtained from any corpse whose cause of death is in question. Quentin Hogg is a crime reporter for the Police Gazette. He is an ex-police inspector who found the environment of Scotland Yard less than stimulating. He has a strong deductive mind and is a very good resource. Edward Hall is a young barrister whom you will find on most days at the Old Bailey. He's a cut above the other unimaginative members of his profession.
Holmes, don't you think you should explain to them the difference between a barrister and a solicitor?
Yes, of course, Watson. A solicitor handles the routine legal business of our society. If you do not have to go before a court, you will have no need for a barrister. If you must go before a court, then your solicitor would engage the services of a barrister. This gentleman is the head chemist at Scotland Yard Criminology Laboratory. It is rumored that Murray lives in the lab. He is eternally bent over one of his tables trying to extract the history of a crime from the physical evidence he's been given. You can learn much from old HR if you can follow the twists and jumps of his thinking. If I can't find something in my own files, I go and examine the overflowing shelves of the great London Library. It is a wealth of information. Head clerk Disraeli O'Brien is your contact in the Office of Records. The Office of Records contains legal records, both criminal and civil, as well as state papers. I think you'll find O'Brien to be a walking, or should I say sitting, encyclopedia of the office's affairs. Porky is not a pillar of society, I dare say, but he is a man who has learned from his mistakes and is trying to start a new life. Although he is no longer in prison, he is still behind bars. Or shall I say, a bar.
Jolly good one, Holmes.
Yes, Watson. Well, the bar in question is the Raven and Rat Inn. Porky is the proprietor. He has been of great help to us in the past, and I expect he will continue to be in the future. Ah, Scotland Yard. If the Yard knew how to examine evidence with any skill, there would be no need for our services. Inspector Lestrade is the pick of a bad lot. But it is true they may be a source of valuable information. After all, the professional police have methods for gathering facts that are not open to us. Now here is a person who usually gets in the last word. Langdale Pike is a human reference work on social scandal, especially on the London scene. He contributes bits of gossip to the garbage papers that cater to an inquisitive public.
What rubbish! What balderdares!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
Ah, you must be referring to the affair of the mummy's curse.
Has the entire city in an uproar. 3 men dead, and they expect us to believe that a 4,000-year-old mummy was the murderer. I'm surprised you haven't taken some interest in this case, Holmes.
To the contrary, my dear Watson. I have made some inquiries, because I dare say I do believe this murderer is a much younger chap.
It's quite amusing, all this hoopla over a mummy's curse, I must say. Not so amusing, of course, the murder of 3 Englishmen.
Have any of your reporters uncovered anything new?
Actually, I've been in Paris the past several weeks. Just returned to London on Tuesday. I've had no involvement with the writing of any of these articles. I believe they are all the work of Philip Travis. He's one of our young reporters. For a short time, he was the Egyptian correspondent.
Was he sacked?
No. He returned to London just a few days ago. I gather he was reassigned to cover the case from here because he had some familiarity with a murder in Egypt.
Do you know Travis?
No, never actually met the chap, although I hear he's a bit of an odd duck.
Thanks for your help, Henry.
Anytime. Let me know when you catch the mummy. That's one scoop I'd like to get.
Such a tragedy. Fine men all, and such outstanding scholars. I still can't quite get over the shock of it.
We understand.
Professor, we're looking for background information on these 3 men so that we can understand how their murders might tie together.
Well, let me begin with Dr. Turnbull. Ebenezer Turnbull was responsible for organizing the Carteret expedition. Quite a remarkable man, really. This was the first time he teamed up with James Windibank. Professor Windibank was one of our most popular lecturers. In fact, several of his former students were also eager to accompany him. I recall him saying that he was having difficulty choosing. Weatherby turned out to be the lucky one, though it seems far from it now, doesn't it? I suppose Smith and Travis turned out to be the lucky ones after all.
Smith and Travis?
Peter Smith accepted the invitation to join another expedition. As for Philip Travis, he was quite keen on accompanying Professor Windibank. In fact, he became exceedingly upset when Andrew Weatherby, a postgraduate student in the department, was chosen instead. Took it rather personally, I should say.
I'm very sorry to intrude on you in your moment of grief.
Oh, that's quite all right. You know, Andrew and I hadn't been married very long.
Long enough to know if he had any enemies?
Oh, Andrew was so unassuming. Everyone liked him.
Including Mr. Uruburu?
I really loved my husband.
I'm sure you did. Oh, English toffee. My favorite.
Would you like one?
Please.
Sorry. You'll have to open this yourself. I've never been any good with these things.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's Court now stands in order. Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the mummy murders.
Yes, my lord.
Tell me then, who was Ebenezer Turnbull's murderer? And what makes you so certain? What was Travis' motive for killing Turnbull? And what of Andrew Weatherby? Who murdered him? So, You say Travis killed Turnbull and Weatherby?
Yes, I believe he did, my lord.
But what was his motive to kill Weatherby, Mr. Holmes? Ah, revenge. The oldest motive in the book. Now, Mr. Holmes, who killed James Windibank? This Travis seems to be quite a busy fellow. What made him kill James Windibank? Excellent job, gentlemen. You have solved the case to my satisfaction. The court stands in recess. Until next time, of course.
Well, Watson, I believe this case is solved. And for your information, it was not the mummy.
Come, come, Holmes. I never thought for a moment it was the mummy.
Of course not, Watson. However, the murderer and the mummy did have one thing in common.
What's that?
They both were the only ones present at the time of the murders, except, of course, the victims.
You state the obvious, Holmes.
Ah, but it is seeing the obvious that is important. First, I saw no reason to assume that we were dealing with more than one murderer. Secondly, the locations of the murders limited the number of suspects.
Limited them? The first murder was in Egypt, the second on ship in the middle of the sea, and the third in London. You call the entire populations of London and Egypt a limited number of suspects?
No, no, Watson. We had to find someone who was in Egypt for the first murder, on the ship for the second, and in London for the third.
Oh, but of course.
According to the newspapers, the Eastern Empress was in Bombay at the time of Ebenezer Turnbull's murder, so that eliminated the ship's crew as suspects. Thus, I needed the list of passengers who boarded the ship at Cairo. It was our visit to Jardine, Mason and Company that provided our first critical clue. From it, I learned that Philip Travis was a passenger. I then learned that Travis was the chap who reported on the first murder. He became one suspect, but I had no motive. Clarissa Weatherby, who was also at the scene of the murder in Cairo, was another possible suspect, since she appears to have had a bit of a dalliance with Mr. Uruburu there on the high seas. So I had found her motive for the murder of Weatherby, but not a motive for the murder of the others.
Then whom did you eliminate?
Mrs. Weatherby. Her hands were not strong enough even to open a jar of English toffee, let alone strangle a grown man.
And what of Travis's motive?
It seems that Travis was a student in the Egyptology department at London University and had studied under James Windibank. He wanted very badly to be chosen as a member of the expedition, but Windibank turned him down. Instead, Weatherby was chosen and Travis was furious. So there you have the motive for two of the murders.
And what of his motive for the murder of Turnbull?
Evidently, Travis had written a vicious article questioning Dr. Turnbull's credentials to lead the expedition. Turnbull's response was quite harsh, probably powerful enough to drive an odd duck like Travis to murder.
Very impressive, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
That is extraordinary sleuthing. Why, I do believe you may have matched Mr. Sherlock Holmes' solution. A remarkable feat indeed.
Society burglar strikes again. Series of burglaries. 6 over the period from June 2nd to June 17th. On July 2nd, the 7th occurred at the home of Sir Sanford Leeds. Cleopatra tiara stolen, it says. As in the other cases, no sign of extensive search by the thief, and only one piece of jewelry involved. Victims elsewhere at the time. Here's a complete list of the particulars, Holmes, if you'd care to read it.
I believe you'll find them in the study.
How do you do, gentlemen? I am Gerald Locke.
Please be seated, Mr. Locke. How can we be of service?
3 days ago, Guy Clarendon was found murdered at Halliday's. It's preposterous, but Miss Frances Nolan has been charged and is being detained at the criminal court, Old Bailey.
Frances Nolan. Ah, yes. Sister of Loretta Nolan. Only surviving heirs of Sir Malcolm Nolan, founder of the Aberdeen Navigation Company.
I seem to recall that Sir Malcolm and Lady Nolan were killed when some lunatic threw a bomb into their carriage. It seems to me that later I heard something about it being a case of mistaken identity. Wasn't one of their little offspring in the carriage with them at the time?
Yes, it was Loretta, Francis's sister. She was only 4. Miraculously, she was uninjured.
Mr. Locke, I've heard that you are a suitor for Miss Frances Nolan's hand, are you not?
Yes.
And was it not also true that she was being courted by Guy Clarendon?
Unfortunately, yes.
Have you any idea why Frances Nolan was charged with the crime?
Well, she was discovered over the body with a pistol in her hand.
That would do it.
But you don't understand. Frances is totally incapable of murder, not even of a scoundrel such as Guy Clarendon.
Scoundrel? But he's from such blue blood. Also, if I'm not mistaken, he's an accomplished batsman for the West London Cricketers, a ranked fencer in international competition.
He was also a bit of a bounder, Watson.
What an understatement. Guy Clarendon was excessively fond of cards and strong drink. His father had all but disinherited him. I tried to tell Frances that Clarendon was no good, but to no avail. And now look at the mess she's in. Will you help?
Most certainly.
This is a difficult thing for a man to say about his only son. But Guy was a wastrel and a ne'er-do-well. Only a short month or so ago, I gave him £5,000 and told him that was the last he'd see of my money. I'd hoped the shock would bring the boy around, make him realize he had to settle down, instead of wasting his life on gambling and gallivanting around with that wild woman.
Which wild woman was that?
Loretta Nolan, of course.
You mentioned gambling, Sir Francis. Have you any idea with whom he gambled or who might have wanted to kill him?
I wish I did. He told us nothing. He only came around when he needed money. And when I told him there'd be no more, we never saw him. Just about broke his mother's heart. There, Gertie. We still have one another.
I've something you ought to know about Master Guy. One morning, rather early, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, I heard a terrible clatter downstairs, so I came down to investigate. It was Master Guy just coming home. He was in a terrible state, all battered and bruised, with a fresh cut on his forehead. I asked him who did it to him, and he wouldn't say. I think he was afraid for his life.
I understand that Wilfred Robards is considering taking Miss Nolan's case. He might be able to help you. If you'd like, I can arrange an interview with Frances Nolan. She's being held downstairs, you know.
We might be able to help you, Miss Nolan, if you could just remember what happened that night in Mr. Clarendon's room.
Well, that's just the trouble. I can't remember anything except seeing Guy's body across the room and the pistol in my hand.
Where did you get the pistol?
I've no idea, though the police assure me it's mine. I didn't know Guy was at Halliday's. I've never even been there before. And why would I shoot him anyway? We loved each other.
There, Miss Nolan. Stiff upper lip.
Thank you.
Miss Nolan, what is the last thing you remember before the room at Halliday's?
Oh, hot cocoa in bed.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, well, every night before I retire, my maid, Grace, brings me a cup of hot cocoa.
How nice.
Yes.
And before that?
Well, before that, I dine with Dr. Trevelyan, as I do every Sunday evening. My sister, Loretta, is under his care. The doctor and I have become good friends over the years. He left at 10 o'clock, as he always does.
May I ask, where did you first meet Guy Clarendon?
At the country estate of Cornelius Oldwine, in March. My sister, Loretta, was attending a party there. I suppose things got a bit out of hand because it seems she dived into a fountain. She caught pneumonia, and I had to go and fetch her home. Guy was also at the estate, and that's where we met.
And he immediately began paying court to you?
Oh, heavens, no. Nobody seems to take much notice of me. I suppose that comes from having such a wildly attractive sister. That's why I was so surprised when he called a few weeks later. We began seeing a great deal of each other. We went on long carriage rides, had picnic lunches. It was all quite lovely. And then on the 5th of June, he declared his love for me and asked for my hand in marriage. I was so happy. I couldn't have killed him.
How do you explain your presence at Halliday's?
Well, I can't. It's just like the other 2 times.
You've had memory losses before.
Yes, twice in the past month. The first time I found myself atop a horse in Hyde Park, with no recollection of how I got there. The last thing I remember was having lunch with my sister Loretta. Then there I was, atop a chestnut mare.
How peculiar.
The funny thing is, I'm terrified of horses.
You mentioned there was a second time.
Yes, a few days later, I met with my solicitor, Hiram Davenport. Then the next thing I know, I'm at the Newgate Street station. I consulted my physician, Dr. Mason, and he was quite as baffled as I was.
One last question, if you will. What is your relationship with Gerald Locke?
Oh, Jerry. He's a dear old friend. Though I'm afraid we had a falling out of late. He said some very unkind words about Guy.
Sure, I remember Clarendon. He and his lady friend used to stop in here from time to time, usually on their way to Kilgore's gaming parlor or coming back from it. Rumor has it, Clarendon was into Kilgore for a sizable sum.
Do you happen to know how much?
£7,000 was the figure I heard. Got to the point Kilgore wouldn't allow him in the door. Clarendon made a big fuss till Gus Bullock stepped in. Clarendon backed down pretty quick. Don't blame him none. Nobody in their right mind would want to mess with the likes of Gus.
Do you think Bullock was involved in the murder?
Nothing you could tell me about that bloke would surprise me. Anyways, Kilgore makes it clear to Clarendon that he wants his money. Then, a month or so later, Clarendon comes in all smiles. And he and Kilgore getting on like chums. Figure Clarendon must have paid him back. Then Calvin Leach steps into the picture.
Now, who's Calvin Leach?
Leach deals in what you might call stolen property. Square dealer, too. Give you one half the value of the article.
What does Leach have to do with Clarendon and Kilgore?
Usually nothing at all. But there it is. Leach, Kilgore, and Clarendon meeting late at night just as thick as thieves. The meetings continued on right up to, well, the night before Clarendon's death.
Very interesting.
Now, we've been standing here jawing, and I don't recall hearing anybody order nothing. What'll it be, mate?
Clarendon, poor chap. He arrived on the 29th day of May and was given a front room on the 3rd floor. 2 days later, he asked to be moved to suite 205.
To your knowledge, did he have any visitors?
Only 2 that I'm aware of. One was a most disagreeable fellow. He was rather large, had a thick walrus moustache, and a very prominent scar down his cheek. He arrived on the 1st of June, well, the very day of Mr. Clarendon's move. He simply came in, sat down in the lobby, and waited. 20 minutes or so later, Mr. Clarendon came down from his room. The big man yanked him aside. I was about to send for a bobby when Mr. Clarendon signed me that all was well. After a few minutes, they left together. I never saw the man again. His other visitor, who came by quite frequently, was a most striking woman. She was quite fashionably dressed. She had a most distinctive laugh, very full and deep. I've no idea who she was.
Please, tell us about the morning of July 2nd.
It was about 9 o'clock when a woman entered. She was rather plain-looking, and I wouldn't have noticed her, except for the fact that she came in the front door, looking neither left nor right, and proceeded directly up the staircase. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds later when I heard a bang, followed by a woman's scream. I dashed upstairs to the 2nd floor. The door to room 205 was open. Inside, I found the body of Mr. Clarendon and the woman who'd just come up. She was lying in a swoon in the center of the room with a pistol in her hand. I revived her with some whiskey. When she came to, she was totally disoriented. She had no idea where she was or what she'd done. When she saw Clarendon's body, she let out a shriek and dropped the pistol. I summoned the police.
Tell me, at what hour are the hotel's front doors locked?
Oh, 10 o'clock, sir. Anyone who arrives after that has to be let in by the night staff. Of course, Mr. Clarendon was never one of those. He was always in his room before 10.
May we see his room? What have we here, Watson? Appears to be a bank statement.
Look here, Holmes. It appears that the maid missed a spot in her sweeping.
Good thing she did, Watson. You're staring at evidence.
Blood.
What's this stain here?
Smells like a fine sherry. Looks like someone's been celebrating.
The question is, was it with the body or over it?
Nothing much here. A couple of shirts and 3 pair of shoes.
But what you failed to notice, my dear Watson, is that one of the pairs of shoes is canvas and has been dyed black. Interesting. A sweater and trousers. An ensemble in black.
Not much of a view. All I can see is a brick wall of the building across the alley.
Ivy vines winding up a trellis. Doctor, we understand that you dined with Frances Nolan on the evening of July 1st.
Yes, that is correct. We dine every Sunday. Her sister Loretta has been under my care for some 10 years. First at the Mesmer Braid Institute and then in private practice.
Without breaching physician-patient protocol, Would you mind telling us the nature of her illness?
She never quite recovered from the overwhelming trauma of watching her parents being blown to bits.
I quite understand.
As is often the case with young orphans, they tend to create fantasies about their parents. Miss Loretta Nolan truly believes that her father was the King of England, making her a princess.
Do you think her unconventional behavior stems from that fantasy?
Absolutely. As a princess, she believes she can do no wrong. I must say that she's worlds apart from her sister Frances.
Do you know Frances Nolan well?
Yes, rather. Through my treatment of her sister, I've known her for years. Let me say that it is difficult to believe that Miss Frances is capable of murder. She has a quiet, unassuming personality. An act of such direct confrontation would not be at all in keeping with her character.
Were Loretta and Frances close?
I know without a doubt that Miss Frances loves and cares for her sister almost as a parent would a child. Miss Loretta, well, she loves her sister as much as she is capable of love.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's Court now stands in session. Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the murder of Guy Clarendon.
That is correct, my lord.
Would you be so kind as to tell the court who killed Mr. Clarendon?
Certainly, my lord.
I see. And what was Loretta Nolan's motive for killing Mr. Clarendon? Ah, greed, pure and simple. Now, have you determined why Frances Nolan went to Halliday's?
I have, my lord.
Please inform the court. Not a sisterly thing to do at all. Is there anything else you wish to report to the court?
Yes, my lord. I believe we've also solved the case of the society burglar.
You don't say. Who is the guilty party? Guy Clarendon was straight from the upper crust. Why ever would he turn to a life of crime? Congratulations, gentlemen. This was a difficult case.
On the contrary, my lord, it was elementary.
That is what you think. Nonetheless, the good people of London are forever in your debt. We thank you.
My pleasure, my lord.
Well, Watson, we should be very pleased with ourselves on this one.
Yes, indeed, Holmes.
2 cases solved for Scotland Yard, though I doubt that Lestrade will consider himself in our debt.
2?
Yes, indeed. First, the society burglar. Clarendon was £7,000 in debt to the gambler Kilgore. Unfortunately, he was in his father's bad graces and he was flat broke.
Do you suppose Kilgore sent Bullock around to rough Clarendon up?
Good deduction, Watson. You're learning. That's why he moved into Halliday's, to escape Gus Bullock.
And to pay off his debts, he took to burglary.
Right you are. He acquired a black sweater, trousers, and a pair of black canvas shoes so as not to be seen or heard in the dead of night. He chose victims of his own class, whose social comings and goings he knew well, and whose homes he'd visited often.
I still don't understand why, after he'd settled in at Halliday's, he changed rooms.
Elementary, my dear Watson. To be at the back of the hotel with a vine-covered trellis conveniently leading in and out of his bedroom window.
Quite so. Positively clever of you.
May I continue?
Oh, please do.
On the 1st of June, Bullock tracked Clarendon down and confronted him in the lobby. Clarendon paid him the £5,000 that was given to him by his father.
But he still owed Kilgore £2,000. And that was the same evening the society burglar struck for the first time.
So pleased you've been paying attention, Watson. Soon after that, Clarendon, Kilgore, and Calvin Leach, a known trafficker in stolen goods, were seen together. Notice, if you will, that 1/2 the value of the first 3 society burglaries is equal to £2,000. Half the value being the price normally paid by Calvin Leach for stolen goods. Notice also that this same amount is equal to the balance of Clarendon's debt to Kilgore.
Fascinating. So with his new vocation, Clarendon now had an easy source of income.
Quite so, as his succeeding bank transactions evidence. On the day after each of the next 3 burglaries, Clarendon made deposits. Everything went along swimmingly, and by June 30th, his debt was paid.
But the tiara was stolen July 1st.
Yes, Watson. Apparently, young Clarendon thought he'd found himself a new vocation. He might have lasted longer at it if he'd chosen something else to steal.
Whatever do you mean, Holmes?
Loretta Nolan's delusion that she was born of royal parentage proved to be his undoing.
If she took it, how did she manage? No one saw her enter or leave.
She came and went the same way Clarendon did, via the trellis. She was armed with a derringer purchased at Escorts in her sister's name. Clarendon returned from his night's work and poured 2 glasses of wine in celebration. That's when Loretta Nolan shot him and took the tiara.
How wicked of her.
Not nearly as wicked as what she did next.
What?
She went to her sister Frances's home and hypnotized her. She then proceeded to instruct her to go to Clarendon's room with the derringer and fire it into the ceiling.
Incriminate her own sister? But why?
If we could determine that precisely, we could start our own institute.
Sick mind, no doubt. But tell me, Holmes, how did Clarendon know the precise locations of each of his victims' jewels?
Excellent question, Watson. Although there is no clear-cut evidence for this, I can only assume that Loretta Nolan must have been in on it too. The only way Clarendon could have known the locations of the jewels was if the victims themselves had told him where to look. None of them recalls having told anyone, but in fact they did tell someone.
Who?
Loretta Nolan. She managed to hypnotize each of the ladies whose jewels were stolen and got them to reveal the precise locations of the family treasures.
And left them with no memory of having done so.
Precisely.
Astounding, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Exemplary job. I commend you on solving the case in such a short time span. Why, your skills could give Inspector Lestrade a run for his money. And perhaps, with a little more work, you might outwit Mr. Holmes himself.
May we be of some assistance, Inspector Smythe?
General Farnsworth Armstead, one of the 6 surviving Waterloo Tontine ticket holders, has been murdered.
Waterloo Tontine?
The Waterloo Tontine was a lottery of sorts, Watson. It was set up in 1815 to aid the veterans of the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington's victory over Napoleon.
Yes, of course, I knew that.
Quite an ingenious plan on the part of the founders. £1 bought a ticket in the name of some young relative. The ticket proceeds amounted to over £1 million. Half went immediately to veterans and their families for medical and hardship expenses.
What became of the other half?
It all went into an account at the Bank of England, where it's been collecting interest all these years.
Very clever. And how does one win this prize?
Simply by outliving all the other ticket holders.
And now you say one of them has been murdered. Very suspicious. Who are the remaining 5?
The oldest is Captain Robert Jurgens, age 82. Then there are Anita and Claire Thomas, who are 80-year-old twins. William Rowland is 79, and Peter Dudley is 77. Poor General Armstead was the youngest at 74.
Seems as if he would have had the best chance to outlive the others.
I recall reading something in the Times about a big to-do involving the Tontine survivors on the 18th.
That's correct. The Waterloo anniversary banquet at the Langham Hotel.
Why is the name Armstead familiar?
He was a noted art collector, I believe. He also authored a well-known book, Treasures of the Conquerors.
Quite right. At the time of his death, General Armstead was working on a revised edition for his publisher, Norgate & Company. It was to contain an entirely new chapter on a fabulous diamond called the Polar Star, which at one point belonged to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. The general had new information which traced the gem to its present owner.
Tell me about the circumstances of General Armstead's death.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, let me see. At 10 o'clock this morning, the General's valet, David Sennett, admitted a caller to the General's study. Sennett says he did not know the man. He was elderly and spoke with a French accent. Sennett told him the General never saw anyone in the morning while he was at work. The gentleman insisted that if Armstead read the letter he had with him, he would make an exception. And so it was. Sennett took the letter in, Armstead read it, and went quite pale. He told Sennett to let the gentleman in. Sensing something amiss, Sennett dawdled in the area of the study for the next 15 minutes or so. Then he heard the distinct sound of swordplay. He tried to enter the study, but found the door locked. Then he heard the crash of breaking glass. He raced to the kitchen and out the back door to enter the study from the garden. By the time he got there, the caller had vanished, and the General was leaning heavily against a shattered display case of military miniatures. Before Sennett could assist him, he dropped a saber from his hand and fell over dead.
And I take it the letter, which so upset the General, was nowhere to be found.
Correct, Mr. Holmes.
Well, we shall put our brains and our feet to the task.
I found the General leaning over the display case. He had his saber in hand, the one that usually resides above the fireplace.
I understand he was a collector of military figures.
Yes, the display in the study shows the last great British charge that swept the French from Waterloo.
Is there any significance to the fact that the figure of Napoleon is facing backward?
How strange. Perhaps I should go and set it straight.
No, don't touch it. Not until the police have concluded their investigation.
Oh, yes, of course.
I also noticed the portrait over the display case.
The late Mrs. Armstead.
Do I detect a note of hostility?
I must admit we did not get on very well. But I might say that Mrs. Armstead did not get on very well with anyone, including the General.
You mean they didn't marry for love?
Hardly. Lord Fitch, Mrs. Armstead's father, arranged the match. Her dowry was very generous. Lord Fitch would have paid any amount to ensure that he would not be left with a spinster daughter, especially such a nasty one.
If there was no love lost between them, why did he keep her portrait in his study?
Actually, it was put up there to needle Mrs. Armstead's brother, the present Lord Fitch. He never approved of the marriage. Even after her death, they were involved with mutual business affairs. They jointly owned stock or some such thing.
Tell me, do you know what the General was doing at the time the intruder arrived?
Yes, he was working on the new section of his book, the part that concerns the gem, the Polar Star. It was very interesting, really. It traces the ownership of the gem to the brother of Napoleon, to the Russian Count Rostov. Unfortunately, the gem was stolen from the Count 3 years ago. As a matter of fact, the General just received a letter from a Pierre Montan, who said that he was willing to divulge the name of the present owner of the gem for the agreed-upon fee.
Do you know where Mr. Montan might be found?
I believe he's staying at the Bridge House Hotel.
Did the General have any encounters with anyone out of the ordinary in the past several days?
Not really. An old friend of his has been in town, Jean-Paul Girard. Neither the General nor I have seen him in 40 years. In fact, they were going to meet this afternoon at the French embassy.
I'm obviously curious about the General's last visitor. Could you describe him, please?
He was an old man, a rather short fellow. He walked with a cane and carried a carpetbag.
Did he give a name?
No. He simply wanted to see the General, and he handed me a letter to take in to him.
Did you read it?
No. It was in an envelope, rather yellowed with age, though I noticed it was addressed in a graceful hand to Captain Armstead, 12th Hussars, the General's old regiment. When the General read it, he went very pale. Then he asked me to admit the gentleman.
Tell me, when you finally got into the room from the garden, were the study doors still locked?
Yes.
I noticed that there is an 8-foot fence surrounding the garden, and that the only way into the garden or out of it is through the kitchen door or the study.
How terribly observant, Holmes.
Farley and I spent over a year quartered together in France in War College. We became the best of friends.
Did you know much of the General's personal life at the time?
He always put the rest of us to shame in the matters of love. Said it was because we had no horse face to spur us on.
Did the General have a passion for horses?
Mon Dieu, no. He was engaged to a terribly unattractive woman by the name of Mary Fitch. Behind her back, that's what he called her. Horseface.
How dreadful. Whatever became of her?
She eventually became Mrs. Armstead and brought her great fortune to the marriage. I believe that Farley looked upon his stay in France as his last great fling.
Are you saying that there was no particular woman at the time?
I did not say that. There was one, but I never met her. My little flower, he called her. I remember one night he could not sleep. He was slightly drunk, and he kept rambling on about promises that must be kept and promises that couldn't be. Finally, he collapsed on the bed with such sadness in his eyes I will never forget it. Ma Fleurette, he said.
How very touching.
Have you seen much of the General over the years?
We have always maintained our friendship through correspondence, until last week, that is. It was the first time we had seen each other in over 40 years. We had supper, and then went to see the French actor Philippe Arnaud perform. The General commented that my presence beside him while French was being spoken reminded him of the old days.
So your visit went well?
Exceedingly well.
Can you think of anything that might have been troubling him?
No, the General was in excellent spirits. He joked about the upcoming Tontine celebration at the Langham, and he was very enthusiastic about the new information concerning the Polar Star. In fact, this week he was supposed to meet with a countryman of mine about it. It is hard to believe that my good friend is gone.
How fortunate that Inspector Lestrade authorized the hotel manager to allow us to search Philippe Arnaud's room.
Perhaps we can return the favor and solve a case for him someday. Today, for example. Let's look around.
How strange that a man who requires a cane would leave without it.
Perhaps he doesn't require it for walking.
Look here at the handle. Well, that could certainly give a fellow a start.
Precisely, Watson. Look here. It appears to be a letter.
Looks quite old. It's addressed to Captain Armstead, 12th Hussars. Shall I read it?
Please do.
Dearest, how I hated you for leaving me, but the child, our child, eased my heartache and muted the hate. Now my sweet baby is dead. How cruel that the innocent must suffer for the sins of others. Now I have nothing. Now I am nothing. I cannot bear the pain. Goodbye, I love you still, Fleurette. How tragic. Why, perhaps this is the very letter that the General read.
Good thinking, Watson.
Ah, but you must see Philippe perform. My nephew is an artist, a wonder. He manages to portray the Emperor Napoleon from age 19 until his last days on the island of Saint-René. You would swear 5 different actors playing the part, but no, it is only Philippe aging before your eyes. At 48, he's the toast of the continent.
You seem rather young to be the uncle of a 48-year-old man.
I am but 8 years older than Philippe, though I can assure you I am his uncle. You might say that our family has a history of late arrivals. Philippe's father was 25 years older than myself, and Philippe's poor sister was 15 years older than he.
Why do you say poor?
She died many years ago under tragic circumstances. In fact, her mother was so upset over her daughter's death that she was put into an asylum. We received word yesterday from the asylum that she had also passed away. It upset Philippe very much, resurrecting old ghosts, as you might say. But we have been playing for enthusiastic audiences for several weeks. As we say in the business, the show must go on. And Philippe is a trooper. He would never allow it to affect his performance.
Can you tell us where Philippe Arnaud is this morning? We should like very much to meet him.
Well, he is not here now. Our company is staying at the Grand Hotel. However, I believe today he is visiting the National Gallery. But if you would come back this evening, I will have tickets awaiting, and after the show, you're welcome to come backstage and meet him.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's Court now stands in order. I see we have the pleasure of your company, Mr. Holmes. I understand you've been investigating the murder of General Farnsworth Armstead.
That's correct, my lord, and I believe I have solved the case.
Do you now? Well then, tell me, who murdered the general? A brilliantly logical deduction, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, my lord.
Now tell us, why was the general killed? Now, tell me, gentlemen, what was the general trying to say when he turned round the figure of Napoleon? Rather clever of the old boy, what?
Indubitably. A man who keeps his wits about him to the last has my undying admiration.
I was wondering, just for the record, could you tell us what the general used to call his wife? Splendid job, gentlemen. Once again, you've done this court a great service and solved the case. I bid you good day.
You say you've come up with a solution, and yet you sit there calmly cleaning your meerschaum. Please, Holmes, tell me what you've uncovered.
Of course, Watson. It's quite simple, really. The most intriguing fact about this murder was the method. Mr. Sennett's report that he heard the distinct sound of swordplay struck me as most odd. It suggested an affair of honor. At General Armstead's home, my suspicions were confirmed. The old letter addressed to Captain Armstead, a rank he'd held some 40 years ago, suggested that it must have concerned something from the past, something that was clearly upsetting to him. That was the reason for the duel.
But how can you be so sure there was a duel?
Simple reasoning, my dear Watson. The general had time to place his chair against the wall, climb upon it, and retrieve a saber. The murderer allowed him to arm himself. A duel is the only event that fits with the facts.
Are you sure the caller carried a sword? I thought all he had with him was a carpet bag and a cane.
Perhaps it only appeared to be a cane.
Ah, yes.
The intruder was described as an old man, yet he left the premises over an 8-foot wall. Clearly, he was in disguise and carried off the ruse with enough expertise to completely fool the general's manservant. The carpet bag must have been used as the receptacle of the disguise when it was no longer needed.
Positively clever of you, Holmes. But what made you think it was Arnaud?
Well, since we were looking for someone adept at the art of disguise, Gerard's mention of the actor Philippe Arnaud struck a chord. Also, Arnaud plays Napoleon. No small coincidence.
What are you getting at, Holmes?
When the general turned round at the figure of Napoleon, he was trying to tell us that his murderer was Napoleon. Or rather, the actor playing Napoleon, Philippe Arnaud.
So Arnaud killed the general to avenge his long-dead sister's honor. Ah, well, unlike most of our cases, this motive was closer to the heart than to the pocketbook.
Quite so, Watson. When Arnaud's sister Fleurette was an impressionable young girl, she fell madly in love with the dashing English captain. When he left, she took her own life.
So pathetic.
Wait, there's more. Fleurette's grief-stricken mother went mad and was sent into an asylum. Thus, in the twinkling of an eye, little Philippe Arnaud, who was but a child himself, lost both his mother and his sister.
It's so sad. I'm sure he was too young to understand the circumstances that caused it.
Yes, but 4 decades later it all became clear when he found a letter written by his sister. It yielded an explanation and a name. Armstead. He came to London armed with that letter and a sword cane.
But he was here for several weeks before he did the deed.
Yes, and he might not have done it at all had it not been for the news of his mother's death. That was the final blow. He went straight away to the general's home to take his revenge. Voila.
Positively brilliant, Holmes. How do you do it?
With his pipe cleaner, of course.
That is extraordinary sleuthing. Why, I do believe you may have matched Mr. Sherlock Holmes' solution. A remarkable feat indeed.